The county courthouse on Main Street was one of those stone buildings that seemed to have been constructed not just to hold trials, but to remind people of the weight of justice. Its marble pillars stretched toward the sky, its tall windows caught the morning light, and the echo of hurried footsteps carried down its wide hallways. Inside, the air carried a faint mix of paper, polish, and nerves, the unmistakable scent of a courtroom in session. On the third floor, Courtroom B was unusually packed for a weekday hearing. Rows of benches were filled with curious locals, legal aides with files stacked in their arms, and reporters poised with notepads, all waiting for the trial of State versus Carter to continue. It wasn't a case of national headlines, but for this small town, it had stirred more attention than usual. A string of burglaries had unsettled the community, and today's hearing was to examine key evidence that might determine whether the accused, a young man named Daniel Carter, would face conviction. At the front, Judge Eleanor Matthews presided over the proceedings. A woman in her late 50s with a stern presence softened only by the silver streaks in her hair. She was known for her no-nonsense approach. She adjusted her glasses and reviewed the documents before her, occasionally glancing over at the jury box, where 12 citizens sat with their own mix of anticipation and unease. Among the witnesses expected to appear was Max, a Belgian Malinois from the Canine Unit. Trained in scent detection, Max had been integral in locating items linked to the case gloves, tools, and even a jacket said to belong to the defendant. Sitting patiently near the front with his handler, Officer Greg Thompson, Max was a striking presence, alert ears, focused gaze, and a posture that seemed to declare loyalty and discipline. For the jurors, it was unusual to have a dog in the courtroom. For the townspeople, it was fascinating. For one small child, however, it was pure wonder. Near the back row, a young mother named Sarah held her 2-year-old daughter Lily on her lap. Sarah had been called as a witness later in the proceedings, not directly tied to the burglary, but as someone who lived near one of the targeted homes. She hadn't expected to bring Lily with her, but with her husband out of town for work and no family nearby to babysit, the toddler had no choice but to come along. Sarah had whispered apologies to the bailiff when she entered, but he had waved her in with a sympathetic smile. Everyone knew children couldn't always be scheduled neatly out of life's demands. Lily was a curious child with wide hazel eyes and a tuft of curls that bounced whenever she moved. She had never been in a courtroom before, and the place seemed enormous to her, filled with strange grown-ups who spoke in careful, sometimes sharp voices. She clung to her mother's arm at first, sucking lightly on her thumb, but then her attention drifted toward the front, where Max lay obediently at his handler's feet. To Lily, Max wasn't a trained police dog. He wasn't a symbol of authority or a participant in the justice system. To her, he was simply Doggy. His sleek fur and steady tail fascinated her, and she pointed at him more than once, whispering, "Doggy, Doggy," into her mother's ear. Sarah tried to hush her gently, rocking her in her arms, though she was grateful Lily's voice was soft enough not to carry. The attorneys shuffled papers at their tables. The prosecutor, Mr. Hayes, was preparing his next statement, while the defense attorney, Ms. Roberts, kept her eyes locked on the evidence list. The quiet hum of tension filled the room. For most people, this was a morning heavy with consequence. For Lily, it was a morning of new sights. The shiny wooden benches, the serious man in a robe up front, and the furry creature who seemed oddly important to everyone around him. As the session began, the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood, then settled back down. Sarah shifted Lily onto her lap, bouncing her gently to keep her calm. Lily's eyes stayed fixed on Max, who, with perfect discipline, hadn't so much as twitched despite the activity around him. The courtroom buzzed with whispered questions. Would the jury trust the evidence? Would the defense poke holes in the dog's findings? Judge Matthews cleared her throat, bringing the chatter to a halt. "This court will now reconvene," she announced. "Mr. Hayes, you may continue." The prosecutor rose and began addressing the jury about the reliability of trained canine units. He described Max's certifications, his history of accurate scent detection, and his role in recovering items linked to the crime. Officer Thompson gave a professional nod as his dog sat stoically by his side. Jurors scribbled notes, some impressed, others skeptical. Meanwhile, Lily squirmed in her mother's arms. Her tiny shoes tapped against the bench. Her little finger pointed insistently toward the front, and her lips formed a shape of words Sarah hoped wouldn't escape into the silent courtroom. But holding back a toddler's voice was like holding back a storm. Still, for the moment, she was quiet. Her gaze never wavered from Max. To everyone else, Max was part of a trial that could change a man's future. To her, he was a mystery with 4 legs and a wagging tail. She watched the way his nose twitched, how his eyes moved, but his body stayed still, and her young mind drew conclusions the adults around her could never imagine. The room carried on with formality. Legal jargon, objections, exhibits displayed on screens. But in the back row, the innocence of childhood silently studied the heart of the matter, not the law, not the defendant, not the stakes of justice, but the simple question every child asks when they meet a dog. Is he good or is he bad? The answer, when spoken aloud, would ripple farther than anyone could predict. For now, the courtroom remained orderly, though the smallest witness present was about to change its course forever. The second day of testimony rolled forward with a rhythm that only those who had spent countless hours in courtrooms could truly appreciate. Lawyers spoke in measured tones. Witnesses shifted nervously in their chairs, and every word was transcribed by the steady hands of the court reporter. Yet for one small observer tucked into the back of the room, none of this was more compelling than the 4-legged presence lying calmly at the front. Lily had never been so close to a dog like Max before. The family down the street had a golden retriever who sometimes barked from behind a fence, but he was friendly and fluffy, more like a stuffed animal come to life. Max was different. His body was lean and strong, his coat sleek, his ears standing up like little flags that moved when someone spoke. He didn't bark, didn't wiggle, didn't act like the playful dogs she knew from picture books. He sat with the seriousness of the adults surrounding him, and that fascinated her even more. Sarah tried to keep her daughter distracted with a small cloth doll she had stuffed in her purse that morning. But Lily only clutched it loosely in one hand while her eyes stayed fixed on the canine. Every so often she whispered, "Doggy," or hummed softly, making Sarah give her a gentle shush. The mother's heart raced with each sound. She worried about the judge frowning, or worse, a bailiff escorting them out before she could give her testimony. Judge Matthews, however, had already noticed the child. Her years on the bench had taught her to spot distractions quickly, but she had also learned to separate disruptions from innocence. A toddler in a mother's lap wasn't the same as a ringing cell phone or an argumentative spectator. She gave Sarah a single acknowledging glance, one that said both "I see you" and "do your best to keep her quiet." It was a look not meant to intimidate, but to remind. Sarah nodded subtly, grateful for the judge's silent patience. At the prosecution table, Mr. Hayes continued his questions. "Officer Thompson, could you explain to the jury the process by which Max was trained to detect specific scents?" The officer spoke confidently, outlining months of exercises, certifications, and field experience. Jurors scribbled furiously, noting the precision of the canine's work. To them, this was evidence of reliability. Proof that Max's nose was not just another tool, but nearly a witness itself. Lily, however, was not convinced by certificates or jargon. She tilted her head, mimicking the dog's posture, then leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "He's watching. Sarah bit her lip to keep from smiling. To Lily, Max wasn't a professional tool. He was a playmate in disguise, a creature she could read with a child's instinct. The atmosphere in the room thickened as the defense prepared to cross-examine. Miss Roberts, sharp-eyed and deliberate, rose from her seat. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Officer," she began, "isn't it true that dogs, even trained ones, can sometimes be influenced by their handlers?" The officer stiffened. "We take great precautions against that, ma'am. But it is possible," she pressed, her voice firm. "If a handler unintentionally gives a signal, even a subtle one, the dog might respond as though it has found something, whether or not it actually has." A ripple moved through the jury box. This was the seed of doubt the defense wanted to plant. Evidence found by Max could suddenly appear less certain, less absolute. In the back, Lily sensed the shift. Though she couldn't understand the words, she felt the tension rising in the voices of the adults. Her little body squirmed against her mother's lap. She craned her neck to look at Max, who still sat calmly by Officer Thompson's side. To her young mind, all the noise and words swirling around were meaningless compared to what she saw. A dog sitting, waiting, listening. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, whispering, "She, almost done, sweetheart." But Lily's attention sharpened. She pressed her palms together, the way she did when she was thinking very hard. To her, the courtroom wasn't divided into prosecution and defense, guilt or innocence. It was a room full of people making loud noises, and at the center of it all sat one silent dog. The jurors leaned forward as Ms. Roberts continued, her tone both respectful and challenging. "So if a dog can be influenced, how do we know that Max's discovery of the gloves and jacket wasn't the result of suggestion? How do we know the evidence is untainted?" The question hung in the air. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably before answering. "Because Max's training is rigorous, and my record with him speaks for itself. He alerts dissent, not to me. For the jury, it was one more statement to weigh. For Sarah, it was one more moment to hope her daughter didn't pipe up. But for Lily, who only saw the dog's stillness and the grown-ups' rising voices, it was the beginning of a thought she couldn't quite form yet. Children, after all, often see what adults overlook, not because they are wiser, but because they notice differently. Where adults saw legal strategy and professional testimony, Lily saw a dog's ears twitch at the sound of his name, saw the faint tap of his paw against the floor, saw the way Officer Thompson's hand hovered protectively over the leash. These were little things no one else noticed, because they were too busy writing notes or making arguments. And Lily, too young to know better, was already deciding what it all meant. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were practicing words in her mind. Sarah caught the motion and placed a gentle finger against them, a silent plea. "Not now, sweetheart. Please, not now." The defense concluded her cross-examination with a flourish, leaving the jury with a lingering sense of doubt. The prosecutor objected to her phrasing, sparking a brief exchange with the judge. Voices rose, gavels tapped, papers shuffled. For most in the courtroom, this was the familiar crescendo of legal theater. But for one toddler, it was simply noise in the background of a much simpler observation. Dog, still sitting, still waiting, still important. The courtroom's tension pressed down like a heavy blanket. Reporters scribbled in shorthand, already imagining headlines. Jurors exchanged cautious glances, wondering which story of the dog they would ultimately believe. But in the very back row, a pair of small hazel eyes stayed fixed on Max, seeing none of the legal trappings, only a dog, in her world, could be either friend or foe. She didn't know it yet, but the moment was building. The tension in the adults' voices, the weight of their words, the solemnity of the place, all of it was creating the stage for her own voice to cut through. with a simplicity that no lawyer could have rehearsed. For now, she only wriggled in her mother's lap, whispering once more, almost to herself, "Doggy." And though the courtroom carried on with seriousness, the faint innocence in her tone seemed to hover in the air, unnoticed by all but her mother. The tension of adults clashed with the innocence of a child, and somewhere in between lay the spark of an unimaginable twist waiting to ignite. The late morning sun had shifted, pouring light through the tall courthouse windows and casting long stripes across the polished wood floor. Courtroom B was heavy with silence, the kind that came not from peace, but from anticipation. Every person inside the jurors, the attorneys, the spectators seemed caught in a collective breath as the trial wound its way through another stretch of testimony. At the front, Max remained perfectly composed. The Belgian Malinois sat upright now, his amber eyes scanning the room with quiet vigilance. To anyone unfamiliar with him, his calm demeanor was impressive, almost uncanny, as if he understood that this place demanded restraint. Officer Thompson kept a steady hand on the leash, though he hardly needed it. Max's training was impeccable, his patience unmatched. To most, Max was an extension of the prosecution's case, a symbol of evidence-gathering precision. But to Lily, he was still just Doggy. The toddler, perched on her mother's lap at the back, had been remarkably well behaved for her age. Sarah had whispered promises of treats afterward, and she'd packed a few crackers in her purse to keep little hands busy. But toddlers could only be distracted for so long. Lily's eyes never strayed from Max. Her fascination had become an invisible thread running through the trial. The attorneys had grown sharper in tone. The defense had managed to plant enough skepticism in the jurors' minds about the reliability of canine searches that the air felt unsteady. The prosecution countered with statistics and certifications, trying to restore confidence. Words like chain of custody, scent contamination, and handler influence bounced across the room like stones skipping water. But the weight of those words meant nothing to Lily. She was restless now, tugging at her mother's sleeve, squirming against the confines of adult seriousness. Sarah leaned down and whispered, "She, almost over, sweetheart." Just a little longer. Lily's hazel eyes flicked again to Max. Something in the way he shifted his head, the flick of his ear, caught her attention. To her young mind, it was a sign, an answer to the unspoken question she had been forming since she first saw him. Her lips parted, her voice small but clear. "Bad dog." The two words seemed to drop into the silence like stones into a still pond. At first, it was just her mother who heard them. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, and she pressed her hand gently against her daughter's mouth, whispering, "No, no, baby, she." But it was too late. The sound had carried farther than she realized. Several jurors turned their heads sharply, eyes widening. A reporter in the gallery scribbled furiously. Even Judge Matthews, who had been about to speak, froze mid-motion, her gavel hovering above the desk. The phrase lingered in the air with a weight far greater than the small voice that had produced it. "Bad dog?" The courtroom stirred. Nervous laughter flickered at the edges, quickly hushed by the judge's sharp glance. The prosecutor's brow furrowed, confusion etched across his face. The defense attorney's lips curled almost imperceptibly into a smile, like a chess player spotting an unexpected opening on the board. Sarah flushed crimson. She whispered frantic apologies, rocking Lily in her arms. "She's just a baby, Your Honor. She didn't mean anything by it, but the damage was already done." Words, once spoken, could not be unspoken, especially not in a courtroom where every sound was documented, every moment potentially significant. "Ms. Roberts?" The defense attorney rose slowly, deliberately. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity, "I believe what we just heard may be relevant." The prosecutor immediately objected. Objection. That was a toddler, not a sworn witness. Judge Matthews rapped her gavel lightly. Order. Let's not descend into theatrics. Still, her eyes flicked toward Sarah and the little girl, then back to the attorneys. The disruption was minor on the surface, but she knew well how even the smallest comment could worm its way into a jury's subconscious. The defense attorney wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'm not suggesting we place evidentiary weight on the words of a child. However, she glanced toward the jury, just long enough for them to register her expression. Sometimes even an innocent observation can highlight what the rest of us overlook. The prosecution bristled. This is absurd. A child repeating two words has no bearing on the credibility of evidence, but the jurors were already unsettled. A few shifted in their seats, whispering faintly to one another. A phrase like "bad dog," coming from someone so innocent, carried a peculiar resonance. It wasn't logic that gave it power, it was the purity of its source. Sarah hugged Lily tightly, wishing she could vanish into the wooden benches. She wanted to tell everyone that her daughter didn't understand. That to Lily, "bad dog," could mean nothing more than a reaction to the dog's stillness, or a memory of being nipped by a neighbor's pet months ago. But Sarah's explanations felt small against the enormity of the courtroom's silence. Officer Thompson glanced down at Max, then back at the judge. His jaw tightened, as if he resented that two little words could undermine years of discipline and trust. Max sat unbothered, his chest rising and falling steadily, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Judge Matthews finally cleared her throat. Ladies and gentlemen, let's remain focused. This was not testimony. It was a child. The jury will disregard it. Her tone was firm, but even she knew it was impossible to erase what had been heard. Human minds didn't work like chalkboards. They could not simply wipe away impressions. Once planted, a seed of doubt had a way of growing, watered by speculation and silence. The proceedings resumed, though shakier now. The prosecutor pushed forward, asking Officer Thompson to reaffirm Max's reliability. The defense, emboldened, pressed harder on the notion of bias and contamination. But every so often, jurors glanced at Max, and some could not help but hear the echo in their heads. Bad dog. For the rest of the morning, Sarah sat rigid, praying her daughter would not utter another word. She kissed Lily's curls, whispered soothing songs, and handed her crackers one by one, anything to keep her occupied. But she couldn't shake the uneasy knowledge that those two words had already slipped free, already taken on a life of their own. By the time the session adjourned for lunch, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters huddled near the hallway, murmuring about the toddler's unexpected outburst. Spectators exchanged theories. Was it coincidence, instinct, or something more? Even jurors walked out in uneasy silence, carrying with them not just the facts of the case, but the voice of a child that had broken through the layers of legal formality. And though none of them realized it yet, those two small words had just altered the trajectory of the trial. When the judge's gavel came down after the toddler's words, the sound reverberated across the courtroom with a sharper edge than usual. The command of order was firm, but the undercurrent of unease did not disappear. In fact, it seemed to swell, carried in the whispers of jurors, the scratch of pens in reporters' notebooks, and the restless energy that filled the air like static before a storm. Sarah clutched Lily tighter than before, heart pounding. She had hoped the incident would be forgotten as quickly as it happened, dismissed as a child's babble. But her instincts told her otherwise. Something had shifted. Something delicate. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes flicking toward her, toward Lily, toward the dog, at the center of it all. Max remained composed at Officer Thompson's feet, his tail curled neatly beside him, his gaze steady. To him, nothing unusual had happened. But to the humans around him, those who had placed faith in his discipline, the child's words gnawed like termites, at the foundation of certainty. The prosecution soldiered forward. Mr. Hayes rose again, his voice booming with artificial confidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we must remember that this is a court of law. Evidence is measured by fact, by record, by sworn testimony, not by the innocent ramblings of a toddler who cannot distinguish between a pet and a professional service animal. The words were meant to reassure, but they only highlighted the disruption. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably, their pens idle. People rarely forgot what they were told to forget. The defense attorney, Ms. Roberts, seized the moment with subtlety. She did not laugh, she did not gloat. She merely allowed a pause before rising to her feet, letting the silence speak before her voice cut through it. With respect, Your Honor, she began smoothly, I do not claim that a child's words are evidence. But I do ask the jury to consider why those words struck them as they did. Sometimes, out of the mouths of babes comes clarity. Objection, Hayes barked immediately. Counsel is attempting to weaponize a child's remark. Overruled, Judge Matthews said after a long pause, though her tone was clipped. Jury will remember that only sworn testimony is to be considered. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen once against the bench. Even she could not ignore the reality that the phrase bad dog had wriggled into everyone's awareness. The rest of the morning testimony limped forward. Officers spoke, evidence was displayed, and the jury listened, but the energy in the room had changed. At times, it felt as though the words of adults were mere background noise to those two syllables still echoing in the minds of everyone present. At the recess, the tension spilled into the hallways. Reporters rushed to their phones, calling editors, dictating what they had just witnessed. Some whispered eagerly about the possibility of a sensational angle. Toddler interrupts trial with startling remark. Others debated whether it was fair to give weight to words spoken without comprehension. Fair or not, they knew readers would devour it. Jurors filed out under strict instructions not to discuss the case, but their eyes betrayed them. Some glanced back into the courtroom before leaving, lingering on Max. Others avoided eye contact altogether, as though the dog's steady presence unsettled them now. Sarah remained seated for a moment, unable to move. She stroked Lily's hair, whispering reassurances more for herself than for the child. You didn't mean anything, sweetheart. You're just tired, that's all. Lily only yawned, resting her head against her mother's chest, content and unaware of the ripple her small voice had caused. Inside the courtroom, Mr. Hayes gathered his papers with sharp movements, frustration radiating from every gesture. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. We can't let a child derail this case. He shot a glare toward Miss Roberts, who simply tucked her notes into her folder, her expression unreadable. But in her eyes gleamed the faintest flicker of triumph. For the defense, doubt was as valuable as proof. And doubt had just been handed to them by the smallest, most unlikely source imaginable. When the court reconvened after lunch, the energy had shifted further. Spectators had doubled, word of the morning's disruption spreading through the town like wildfire. People wanted to see the child, the dog, the strange drama unfolding in a case that had seemed so straightforward only a day before. Judge Matthews noticed the Fuller gallery and bristled. She was determined to keep the trial on track, to prevent it from becoming a circus. Yet even she could not fully control perception. She glanced once at the jurors, noting how some looked distracted, thoughtful, even wary. They would obey her instruction, not to consider the child's words as evidence, but she knew better than most that the human mind clings to what unsettles it. The afternoon's testimony was a blur of procedure. Scientific experts discussed fingerprints, surveillance footage, and timelines. But the defense returned often, almost strategically, to the reliability of the canine unit. Every mention of Max's name seemed to tug at the invisible thread left dangling by Lily's remark. At one point, Ms. Roberts asked a question with deliberate casualness. "Officer Thompson, has Max ever made an error in the field?" The officer hesitated, just long enough for jurors to notice. Every dog, like every human, has limits. But his accuracy rate is extremely high. And when he does make an error, Roberts pressed, would you say it is obvious immediately, or does it sometimes go unnoticed until later? Hayes objected, sustained, but the seed was planted. Again, all eyes drifted to Max, who lay silent, unaware of the burden his presence now carried. The confusion deepened when, during a brief pause, one juror scribbled something in the margin of his notebook. "Bad dog?" He underlined it twice, then stared at the page as though it carried more weight than any testimony he had heard that day. By the end of the session, the trial felt as though it had slipped slightly off its axis. What began as a confident march toward conviction had become murkier, uncertain. For Sarah, the confusion was agony. She had wanted to remain invisible, to give her testimony and go home. Instead, she found herself at the center of attention she never asked for. Every reporter seemed to glance at her as she left. Every spectator craned their necks for a glimpse of the mother with the child who spoke. She kept her head down, clutching Lily tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with conversation. Some dismissed the incident as nothing more than a funny moment. Others swore it meant something. The children had a way of sensing truth adults ignored. But inside the courtroom, in the official record of the trial, confusion had taken root. The jurors were no longer weighing evidence alone. They were wrestling with a child's words that no one could quite forget. Two simple syllables had shaken the foundation of certainty. And as the day closed, no one, not the judge, not the lawyers, not the mother, not the handler, could predict how far the echo of "bad dog" would travel in the days ahead. The following morning, Courtroom B was even more crowded than before. News of the toddler's outburst had spread like wildfire across town. By dawn, local papers had already run headlines with varying shades of drama. Toddler calls police dog bad in court. Child's outburst casts shadow on burglary trial. Two words that stunned the courtroom. Radio hosts debated it, some laughing, others insisting it revealed something deeper. Even neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles, speculating on whether the words carried hidden meaning. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged. Reporters filled the back rows, spectators leaned forward, and even the jurors seemed restless. Though Judge Matthews had firmly instructed them to disregard Lily's words, human nature had its own stubborn ways. The phrase lingered in the air like a perfume that refused to fade. The prosecution opened with renewed determination, attempting to steer the case back to hard evidence. But Ms. Roberts, ever precise, began the day by filing a motion. "Your Honor," she said, standing tall at her table, "given the events of yesterday, the defense requests a thorough review of the K-9 unit's role in this investigation. It is now a matter of public perception and potential juror bias that the dog's conduct be examined in full." Hayes nearly leapt from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. We cannot allow a child's nonsense to dictate the direction of this trial." But Roberts remained composed. "With respect, this is not about a child's words. It is about ensuring fairness. If the jury is questioning the reliability of this evidence, as I believe they are, then it is our duty to address those concerns directly. Otherwise, the integrity of this trial is compromised." Judge Matthews studied her for a long moment, then shifted her gaze to the jurors. She could see it plainly. Curiosity, doubt, even quiet anticipation. The child's words had planted seeds, and ignoring them might only make them grow unchecked. She sighed, tapping her pen against the bench. Motion granted. The court will allow limited review into the K-9 unit's procedures as it relates to this case. I want it clear, however, that this is not an indictment of the program, but a clarification of evidence. The gavel came down, and just like that, the investigation widened. Later that afternoon, Officer Thompson was recalled to the stand. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight. Max lay by his side as always, steady and unbothered, unaware that his reputation now teetered under scrutiny. Roberts approached with the patience of a surgeon. "Officer Thompson, when Max conducted his search of the defendant's residence, were you wearing your body camera?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "And was that footage reviewed by your superiors?" "It was. Would you object to this court reviewing it as well?" Thompson hesitated. He glanced at Hayes, who gave a reluctant nod. No objection. The bailiff was dispatched, and soon the courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a monitor was wheeled in. The footage flickered to life, grainy but clear enough to capture the search. Jurors leaned forward. Reporters scribbled eagerly. Even Sarah, still seated with Lily at the back, felt her breath hitch. On screen, Officer Thompson and Max entered the small, cluttered house that belonged to Daniel Carter. The camera shook as the officer moved room to room. Max sniffed corners, paused at furniture, and eventually pawed at a closet door. "There," Thompson said on the recording. "That's his alert." The closet opened to reveal gloves and a jacket, key pieces of evidence the prosecution had leaned on heavily. The video seemed straightforward. But then, as Roberts replayed a section in slow motion, a subtle detail emerged. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, "watch closely." On the second viewing, the jury noticed it. A faint gesture, almost imperceptible, as Thompson's hand tugged slightly on the leash just before Max pawed at the door. It wasn't obvious the first time, but slowed down, it looked less like a coincidence and more like a cue. A murmur rippled through the room. Hayes objected immediately. "This is conjecture." The officer was maintaining control of his animal, nothing more. But Roberts pressed on. Or was he signaling? Even unconsciously? Because if so, ladies and gentlemen, then the so-called alert is not the independent finding of a trained dog. It is the product of handler influence. And that means the evidence you've been told to trust may not be reliable at all. Judge allowed the jury to view the footage again. Each time, the moment grew heavier. Some jurors leaned back, arms crossed, expression skeptical. Others leaned forward, scrutinizing every frame. Thompson's face flushed red. "I didn't signal him," he said firmly. "I've worked with Max for years. He knows his job, but the damage was done." The footage had shown something small, something subtle, but enough to feed the very doubt Roberts had hoped to cultivate. By the end of the day, the prosecution scrambled to contain the fallout. Hayes argued passionately that no system was flawless, that the presence of gloves and jacket in the closet was undeniable regardless of how they were found. Yet Roberts had shifted the narrative. The jury wasn't only weighing the defendant's guilt anymore, they were questioning the process itself. And in trials, once doubt entered the bloodstream, it was nearly impossible to purge. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled. Cameramen jockeyed for position. A reporter caught Sarah as she tried to leave with Lily, asking breathlessly, "Ma'am, did you realize your daughter's words would spark all this?" Sarah shielded Lily from the flash of cameras, murmuring, "She's just a child." She didn't mean anything, but her words did little to douse the frenzy. The trial that had begun as a routine burglary case had transformed into a spectacle, fueled by the innocent remark of a toddler and the scrutiny it demanded. And as the courthouse doors closed behind them, the sense lingered. What else might be revealed if the investigation continued to peel back its layers? The courtroom's mood shifted palpably after the body cam footage was played. What had once seemed like a straightforward case now felt precarious, as if the foundation beneath it had cracked. Jurors whispered during recess, reporters typed furiously, and even the spectators sensed history in the making. By the time proceedings resumed, the trial no longer revolved around the burglary itself. It revolved around the dog. Officer Thompson sat stiff in the witness chair, hands folded tightly in front of him. Max rested calmly at his feet, unaware that his every move was being dissected not just by lawyers, but by a community hungry for answers. The defense attorney, Miss Roberts, rose once more with the poise of someone who knew momentum was on her side. "Officer," she began, "would you agree that a K-9's alert is only as reliable as its independence?" Thompson's jaw flexed. "Yes, that's why we train to eliminate handler influence." "And yet," Roberts said, nodding toward the monitor, still sitting dark in the corner, "we've all just seen footage where a subtle leash movement occurred moments before Max's so-called alert. Now, I am not accusing you of intentional misconduct. But can you admit, under oath, that unconscious cues are possible?" Hayes leapt to his feet. "Objection badgering the witness." "Overruled," Judge Matthews said, her voice calm but edged with tension. "The witness may answer." Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Any handler knows that cues are possible. But in this case, I did not give one." Roberts let the words hang, then nodded as though satisfied. But she wasn't finished. "Your Honor, the defense requests a full review of all body cam footage from the search, not just what was selected for evidence. If we are to believe this investigation was impartial, then we must see the entire picture." A murmur spread through the gallery. Even Hayes hesitated before replying. "That's unnecessary. The footage has already been logged, and logged by whom?" Roberts interrupted, her tone cool but piercing. Hayes opened his mouth, closed it again. His hesitation was all the defense needed. Judge Matthews tapped her pen thoughtfully, then nodded. "Request granted. Bailiff, ensure the jury is provided with the complete footage for review." The following day, the courtroom dimmed once more as the jury watched hours of raw footage from the search. At first, it seemed routine. Officers moving through cluttered rooms, Max sniffing corners, Officer Thompson giving calm commands. But then something unexpected happened. On the video, Max paused near a kitchen counter. His nose hovered over a small plastic bag tucked behind a stack of dishes. The dog's body stiffened, a clear alert. Yet Thompson tugged the leash and redirected him toward the hallway. Gasps filled the room. "Freeze it there," Roberts said sharply. The bailiff paused the footage. On the screen, Max could be seen glancing back at the counter as he was pulled away. Roberts turned to the officer, her expression unreadable. "Officer Thompson, can you explain why you ignored your dog's alert at this moment?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. That bag contained food waste. Old sandwich wrappers. It wasn't relevant to the case. Did you check it? Roberts pressed. "No, ma'am. I knew what it was, but the video told another story." To the jury, Max's stiffened posture suggested otherwise. Roberts leaned closer, her voice low but sharp. "So, you disregarded your K-9's alert because you assumed it was unimportant. Yet you insist his other alerts were flawless. Which is it, officer? Is your dog reliable, or only when it supports your theory?" The question sliced through the courtroom like a blade. Hayes shouted, "Objection!" But the damage was already done. Jurors exchanged uneasy looks. The prosecution's strongest evidence now appeared vulnerable, tainted by selective interpretation. During recess, the courthouse hall buzzed with speculation. What was in that bag? Why had it been ignored? Rumors flew faster than facts, but one truth became undeniable. The dog's credibility was no longer beyond reproach. Sarah sat quietly in a corner, Lily asleep against her shoulder. She hadn't asked for any of this. Yet she could not ignore the growing realization that her daughter's innocent words had triggered the unraveling of a case that once seemed sealed. Reporters whispered nearby, debating headlines. One jotted notes for tomorrow's edition. Ignored alert raises questions about evidence. Another grinned as he said, all because a toddler called him a bad dog. Back in the courtroom, the review of footage continued. Hours passed, each minute revealing more small inconsistencies, moments where Max showed interest in something his handler overlooked, or where subtle leash movements coincided with alerts, though none were smoking guns on their own. Together, they painted a troubling picture, evidence that was not as clear-cut as the prosecution claimed. Roberts rose again, her tone measured but confident. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've now seen what the defense has suspected all along. This investigation was not a perfect process. It was flawed, fallible, and filtered through the biases of those conducting it. We do not fault the dog. Max is loyal, obedient, and well-trained. But even the best dogs can be misused intentionally or otherwise. And when that happens, the evidence they provide cannot be trusted beyond reasonable doubt. Hayes countered fiercely, slamming his notes onto the table. This is a distraction. Gloves and jackets were still found in the defendant's home. You saw them with your own eyes. That is fact. But the jury's eyes told another story. They were no longer focused on the defendant's belongings. They were fixated on the process, the doubt, the possibility that what had seemed certain might have been orchestrated, however subtly. The seed had sprouted into something undeniable. By the time the session ended, the trial's momentum had shifted entirely. What began as a case about burglary was now a case about integrity, reliability, and the weight of doubt. And in the center of it all, silent, obedient, unaware, lay Max. He had done nothing wrong, yet his very presence had become a symbol of uncertainty. And it all began with two simple words, spoken by a child too young to understand the storm she had unleashed. By the seventh day of the trial, Courtroom B no longer felt like an ordinary chamber of justice. It felt like a stage, and every person inside, from judge to jury to spectators, was playing a role in a drama that none had expected. The burglary case had become secondary. Now, the spotlight rested on a dog, his handler, and the ripple effect of two innocent words. The morning session began with the jurors seated quietly, though their eyes betrayed a kind of restless energy. The weight of what they had witnessed the day before, the overlooked alert, the leash tug, the defense's cool dismantling of the evidence still pressed heavily on their minds. Judge Matthews, who had been known for her unflappable demeanor, appeared more somber than usual. She tapped her gavel gently, not to demand silence, but as though to center herself before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I remind you that this trial is about determining guilt or innocence based on evidence presented. However, she paused, her gaze sweeping the room. I am also mindful that fairness demands transparency. The court will hear final examinations of the K-9 evidence today. The air thickened. Everyone knew what was coming. The prosecution went first. Hayes, weary yet still combative, stood with squared shoulders. His voice carried urgency, almost desperation. Members of the jury, he said, we cannot lose sight of what truly matters. Gloves, a jacket, and other stolen items were found inside Daniel Carter's home. That is fact. These are not illusions, not fabrications. The defense wants you to focus on technicalities, on whether Officer Thompson tugged a leash or ignored an alert. But ask yourselves, do these details erase the presence of stolen property? Do they change the truth? He paced deliberately, gesturing toward the evidence table, where the bagged items sat under dim courtroom light. These objects connect Carter to the crime scene. That is undeniable. To suggest otherwise is to ignore reality in favor of distraction. The law is not about what-ifs. It is about facts. And the facts are clear. His words echoed through the room, firm and insistent. For a moment, it seemed as though he might reclaim the narrative. Several jurors nodded, their expressions tightening as if to remind themselves of the concrete evidence. But then Roberts rose, and the balance shifted once more. She moved slowly, deliberately, her hands clasped behind her back as she faced the jury. Her voice was soft at first, requiring the room to lean in. "Yes," she said. "Objects were found in Mr. Carter's home. No one disputes that. But the question before you is not whether gloves and jackets exist. It is whether the process that uncovered them was fair, reliable, and free of influence. Because if the process is compromised, then everything it touches is suspect." She walked to the monitor, pausing by the still image of Max, frozen mid-alert, at the kitchen counter. His body stiff, nose pointed, eyes sharp. "Yesterday," she continued, "you saw a moment when this loyal dog attempted to do his job, only to be redirected. You saw with your own eyes that the investigation was not as impartial as you were told. And if one alert was disregarded, how can you trust the alerts that were embraced? How can you separate truth from assumption when the very tools of justice were not applied consistently?" Her voice grew firmer. "This case is not about condemning a dog. Max is blameless. This case is about questioning the humans who control him, who decide what counts as evidence and what does not. You are asked to render a verdict that may strip a man of his freedom. Shouldn't you be absolutely certain the evidence against him is untainted?" The courtroom was silent. Even Hayes, usually quick to object, remained seated, his jaw clenched. The jury's expressions told the story best. Some looked unsettled, others downright troubled. A few leaned back as though trying to create physical distance between themselves and the evidence they had once accepted without question. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already forming in their minds. "Defense erodes trust in canine evidence. Handler's methods under fire. Trial shifts from burglary to police integrity." Even Sarah, seated near the back with Lily, felt the tremors. She watched as the defense's words rippled through the jurors like waves across a pond. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had only wanted to complete her civic duty and leave quietly. Yet here she was, clutching her daughter close, knowing that the child's innocent exclamation had turned an ordinary trial into a referendum on justice itself. The afternoon session only heightened the tension. Expert witnesses were called in: a former canine handler, a professor of animal behavior, even a retired judge familiar with cases involving dog alerts. One after another, they reinforced a central truth. While K9 units were invaluable, their reliability hinged on the neutrality of their handlers. "Dogs are extraordinary," one expert said, "but they are also eager to please. A slight movement, a change in tone, even body language can influence them without the handler realizing it. This is why oversight and transparency are vital." Jurors scribbled notes. Hayes objected repeatedly, arguing that the defense was turning a burglary trial into a seminar on canine psychology. But the damage could not be undone. The once ironclad evidence now seemed porous, vulnerable. And in the legal arena, vulnerability meant doubt. When court adjourned for the day, the courthouse steps erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into faces, and the public clamored for sound bites. Did the defense just dismantle the state's case? One reporter shouted, "Is this trial now more about police accountability than burglary?" Another asked. Even late-night talk shows began picking it up. One comedian quipped, "Only in America does a toddler heckle a dog and nearly overturn a criminal trial." Laughter rippled through audiences. But beneath the humor was a sobering truth. The credibility of the justice system was being questioned on a national stage. Inside her chambers that evening, Judge Matthews sat alone, reviewing her notes. She had presided over dozens of trials, but none had taken such a surreal turn. 2 words from a child, she thought. 2 words, and the whole machine wobbled. She rubbed her temples. The law was supposed to be steady, immovable. Yet here was proof that sometimes it hinged on the smallest of things, a glance, a pause, or a toddler's innocent voice. And tomorrow, the jury would begin deliberations. The outcome was no longer predictable. Would Carter walk free, his case dismissed as tainted? Or would the jury cling to the tangible evidence, trusting that despite flaws, truth still pointed toward guilt? No one knew. But one thing was certain. Whatever verdict they delivered, this trial would be remembered, not for the burglary, not for the stolen jacket, but for the shockwaves that rippled outward from a toddler's 2 words. The day of deliberations dawned heavy with anticipation. Courtroom B, which had by now become the heartbeat of the entire county, sat eerily still as the jury filed out to begin their discussions. For the first time since the trial had begun, the room was quiet, not because of order, but because of absence. The spectacle had shifted behind closed doors, leaving everyone else suspended in uncertainty. Sarah sat in the gallery with Lily, who squirmed on her lap, unaware of the tension thrumming through the adults around her. Cameras were banned from the deliberation room, but reporters camped outside the courthouse, waiting for any sign of movement. Headlines buzzed online. Will the toddler's words tip the scales? Case that became bigger than burglary nears verdict. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens wrestled with a question larger than the burglary itself. Some jurors began with certainty. The gloves and jacket were there, one man insisted. That's hard evidence. But how were they found? Countered another. If the process was compromised, how can we trust any of it? The defense made that clear. For hours, they circled around the same debate. The evidence existed, yes, but could it be trusted? Was the discovery independent, or had it been influenced by subtle, even unconscious actions of Officer Thompson? The footage replayed in their minds. Max stiffening at the counter. The tug on the leash. The overlooked bag. One juror, a schoolteacher, finally said aloud what others were thinking. If this was a test I was grading, I couldn't give it a passing score. Too many mistakes. By mid-afternoon, doubt had spread like ink on paper. When the jury finally returned, the room filled with electricity. Everyone stood as they filed back to their seats, faces solemn, their collective decision sealed in a folded slip of paper. Judge Matthews cleared her throat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff took the paper and handed it to the judge, who read silently before returning it. Her expression was unreadable. In the matter of State versus Daniel Carter on the charge of burglary in the first degree, she paused, the room leaning forward. We find the defendant not guilty. The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock and relief across the courtroom. Daniel Carter collapsed into his chair, his hands covering his face. His attorney, Ms. Roberts, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, though her eyes flickered with quiet triumph. Across the aisle, Hayes slumped, the fight drained from him. In the gallery, Sarah clutched Lily tight, her heart pounding. Around her, murmurs erupted, blending disbelief with exhilaration. Some gasped, others whispered, and a few simply shook their heads. Outside, chaos reigned. Reporters rushed down courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to speak. Not guilty, shouted one. The jury found him not guilty. Within minutes, the story spread across the nation. Cable news stations broke into programming, anchors trading incredulous glances as they announced the verdict. Social media erupted, hashtags multiplying. Hashtag bad dog case, hashtag 2 words trial, hashtag justice or joke. Late-night hosts seized the moment. A toddler says 2 words, and suddenly the legal system unravels, one quipped. I've been trying 2 words for years. Pay me, and nothing changes. The audience roared with laughter, but beneath it was a simmering seriousness, a collective recognition that the trial had exposed cracks in the justice system. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Matthews made one final statement before dismissing the jury. This trial has reminded us that justice is fragile. It rests not just on evidence, but on trust in the process, trust in the people who uphold it. When that trust wavers, the system itself trembles. Let us never forget that. Her words, solemn and deliberate, echoed as the court emptied for the last time. That evening, Daniel Carter walked out of jail, a free man. His face, once weary and haunted, now bore an expression of stunned relief. Reporters swarmed him, demanding to know how it felt to have his life changed by a toddler's words. I don't know what to say, Carter admitted, his voice hoarse. I just know I'm grateful for my attorney, for the truth coming out, and maybe even for that little girl. He offered a weak smile before being whisked away. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, faced a different fate. Though never formally charged with misconduct, his reputation was badly tarnished. Internal Affairs opened a review into his handling of Max, and whispers spread through the department about whether he would ever work the K-9 unit again. Max himself was reassigned temporarily, his once pristine record now under a shadow he could never understand. As for Sarah, she tried to return to normal life. Yet everywhere she went, people recognized her. At the grocery store, strangers whispered. At the park, mothers approached her with wide eyes. Is she the one? They asked, nodding toward Lily. Sarah would smile politely, but inside she wrestled with unease. Her daughter had not meant to change the course of a man's life, or to spark a national conversation about justice. She had only spoken 2 innocent words, words born of a child's unfiltered world. Yet those words had shifted the weight of a trial, toppled a case, and revealed cracks that might otherwise have stayed hidden. Months later, a documentary crew came to town, filming interviews for a feature titled 2 Words, The Trial That Changed Everything. They asked Sarah what she thought about the verdict, the chaos, the notoriety. She looked at Lily, now a little older, her curls bouncing as she played with blocks on the carpet. I think it reminds us, Sarah said softly, that truth doesn't always come from where we expect it. Sometimes it comes from innocence. Sometimes it comes from a child who doesn't even know what she's saying. But maybe that's what makes it powerful, because it's unfiltered, unplanned, and real. The interviewer pressed further. Do you think the justice system was right to let Carter go free? Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. That's not for me to say. But I do know this. If a system can be shaken by 2 simple words, maybe it's time we look closer at how strong that system really is. And so the story entered history, not as a routine burglary trial, but as a parable about justice, perception, and the fragility of truth. Legal scholars debated it in classrooms. Journalists revisited it in retrospectives. Politicians even cited it in discussions about reform. But for those who had been inside that small county courtroom, the memory was far simpler. A toddler, perched on her mother's lap, had pointed at a police dog and spoken 2 words that no one expected. Bad dog. 2 words that rippled outward, changing lives, shaking institutions, and reminding a nation that sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths.